Hello everyone, and welcome to The Painting Paladin. My name is Justin, and this is the first part in our Adepticon Army series. Now the first unit that I'll be working on is the core of the army, the Smurf Spearmen. Now when working on a unit like this, it's best to paint your miniatures in batches instead of doing one at a time. When dealing with smaller numbers, I find that 5 to 10 miniatures at a time is the best. That way you don't get burnt out on painting the same thing over and over again. With that being said, let's head to the work desk and get started, shall we? Alright, now before we begin, I undercoated this model with gray Seer spray. Now the first color that we're going to be using is Baharroth Blue, and we're going to be painting this on all the exposed skin areas as well as the little nub tail that he has on the back. Once the Baharroth Blue is dry, we can move on to our next color, which is going to be Guilliman Blue Glaze. Now this is just going to be applied right on top of the Baharroth Blue like a wash. Be careful when applying this to avoid any pooling, but if you do get pools, use the tip of your brush to soak them up. Once that Guilliman Blue is dry, we can move on to our next color, and that's actually going to be Gray Seer again. Now this time we're going to apply it using a brush, and the reason we're doing this is first, to make sure it's got a smooth even coat around the whole model in case the spray had missed anything, and secondly is to just touch up any of those parts that the blues might have gotten on. Once the gray seer is dry, the next color that we're going to be using is the contrast paint, Apothecary White, and this is just going to be applied right over that gray seer layer. Now that the Apothecary White is dry, a bulk of our model has now been finished and only little details remain. So the first thing that we're going to do is paint the shaft of the spear, and the color we're going to be using for that is Steel Legion Drab. The next thing that we're going to be painting is the tip of the spear, and the color that we're going to be using for this is Leadbelcher. Once the tip is finished being painted, the next thing we're going to do is give the spear an all-over wash of Nuln Oil, just to bring out some definition as well as add some shading. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be using is Abaddon Black. Now this is going to be for the two straps that are on his left hand there for the shield, as well as his eyebrows. Now that I got this first guy knocked out, I'm going to go back and finish these other four using the batch painting method. Now what that is painting each step on all four guys before moving on to the next step. Now that I have the other four finished and they're all at the same step, the next thing that we're going to be doing is basing our models. Now for this, I'm going to be using just regular white PVA glue and some fine grained sand you can find at your local hobby store. Now when doing this step, apply the glue straight to the base and using a cheap brush, just spread the glue around so that it's thin but evenly spread. Once the glue has been spread out fully, dip your model into the basing material, moving it around a little so that the basing material fully covers the base. Then, pull the model out and give it a little shake so that the excess material falls off back into the container. While the bases and basing materials dry, we can move on to the next part, and that's going to be painting the shields. Now I preemptively spray the shield with Leadbelcher spray. Now the first color that we're going to be using is Steel Legion Drab, and that's just going to be to paint all the wood parts on the shield. Now that the glue on the bases and basing material is dry, what we're going to do next is clean the edges of the bases. Now to do this, I just used a knife and scraped along the edges of the bases, catching any bits that are sticking out. With those edges all cleaned up, we can move on to our next step, and that's going to be painting the base. Now for this, I used the apple barrel paint, Nutmeg, and heavily watered it down. Now the reason I did that is so that it flows smooth into all the cracks, as well as not being too thick so you don't lose detail. When doing this step, just take your time and lightly use the paintbrush on the basing material so that it doesn't get knocked loose. The coat of paint will help seal in any material that hasn't fully been glued down. With the base all painted up, we can move on to our next step, and that's affixing the shield to the model. Now the reason I chose to do this after painting the base was so that when you're painting the base, you don't accidentally get some of that paint on the shields. So with that, the next thing we need to do is add 2 dabs of super glue, and we're just going to put those right where the shield straps are on the forearm. With the shield secured to the model, we can move on to our next step, and that's going to be giving the shield a wash of Nuln Oil, and that'll help bring out its definition as well as add some shading to it. Be careful when applying this to avoid any pooling, but if you do get pools, use the tip of your brush to soak them up. Once that wash is dry, we can move on to the next step, and that's going to be painting the lip of the bases. Now you can use any color you want for this, but I chose to use the Black Templar contrast paint and applied it heavily around the lip. Now you're probably going to need to use 2 coats when applying this, so just paint 1 coat on, set it aside and let it dry while you finish the rest of your models, and then come back and paint another coat so that you have a nice solid black coat. With that lip being painted, you could call this model finished. However, I decided I was going to go one step further and add some flock to my models. The first step in this process is apply some white glue back to your base there, and using that paintbrush you had previously used, spread it out to where you want the flock to stick. Now the next step in this process is applying the flock that you wanted to the base there where you just had spread the glue out. Now I'm using a tough grass, and for this I'm using my tweezers and heavily applying the flock to that area and gently patting it down to make sure that all the flock sticks to the glued areas there. Once I have all the flock gently patted down, I rotate the model to its side and tap the bottom over the container, knocking free all that excess flock that hasn't been adhered to the base. And lastly, after I knock off all the excess, I take my tweezers and I run them upwards along the side of the bases there to make sure that any of that flock that is sticking out funny sideways is pointed upwards. With that flock applied, these 5 spearmen are ready to go to battle. Now I just need to keep repeating those previous steps until I reach my desired number of spearmen. Now that these first 5 are done, you just need to repeat the process over again until you reach the required number you need. Now, a few things to remember. The first is set yourself a pace so that you don't do too much at once and get burnt out, or not enough and miss completing them for your event. The second thing to remember is although this is batch painting, you still want to take your time to avoid any mistakes, because making lots of mistakes can set your time back. But if you make any mistakes, you can go back to the previous colors and fix them. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed the first part in our epic 7-part mini-series. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you want to stay up to date with future videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks everyone!